Yeah. Any cars that she crashed, anything?
Gosh.
Being on drugs?
Hold on a second. Hold on.
Yeah.
Whoops. Whoops. I lost it. How do I get rid of this? This morning was 11. But I don't understand. So good morning, Vietnam. Welcome to the Torah portion study that we do on Sundays. And we discussed the portion that was read yesterday. So the portion we read yesterday was Tetzaveh, and the Torah continues its theme of getting this sanctuary in the desert. So the previous week they discussed all the furniture. You have to have, and the actual building, the foundation and the walls, and then the menorah, and then the ark, and then the table, and then the altar, and then the other altar, etc. This week, the Torah really talks about the clothing of those, the Kohanim, the priests that worked in the temple, and the high priest that worked in the holy temple. And kind of, it starts off with what their job is, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then the inauguration. The 7 days, right? Biden had just 1 day, right? The 20th. And then, but here there was 7 days. There was inauguration of the Cohen Kadal, the high priest, and then they were inaugurated, and Aaron became the high priest permanently for 40 years. So the parsha, so let's talk about the parsha for a minute before we go into detail. This is the only portion. This is the only Torah portion since Moses was introduced, which was Exodus chapter 1 or chapter 2, until all the way Deuteronomy, to the very end of Deuteronomy. Moshe was mentioned every single parsha, every single one without fail. This one, there's no mention of Moses' name. The Torah begins, V'ata Tetzaveh, and you shall command, and you shall do this, and you shall do that. There's no mention. Usually it says that Hashem, God, spoke to Moses saying. God spoke to Moses and Aaron saying. It doesn't mention it from beginning to end. There's no mention of Moses. And it's the sages point out the reason is the whole building of the sanctuary took place after the golden calf. If they did not worship the golden calf, there wouldn't be a need for a sanctuary. You're connected with God, and you don't need a focal point. You have it within you. But once they severed that by worshiping in the golden calf, God said, okay, in order to gain atonement, I'm going to need sacrifices, I'm going to need worship, I'm going to need something practical, because otherwise you're going to be led astray and worship whatever moves. So at least let me get you to worship me. But before then, before God reached the point of making a sanctuary, God said, I'm going to annihilate the Jewish people. I'm just going to annihilate everybody, and I'm going to begin again. And Moses, I'm going to begin with you, your children, and your children's children. They will be the rise of the Jewish people. Moses turned to God, and Moses says, if you wipe them out, if you do not forgive them, then erase my name from your book. And now, what's fascinating is Moses was protecting Jews that worship the golden calf. So the actual Jews that physically worship, were executed by the Levites. But and Moses was fine with that. It was he didn't, just because they enabled the worship, the golden calf, to be erected and to be fashioned, and it doesn't mean that they should die. So Moses stuck up for the Jewish people. And now God was in a conundrum. It really was. If Moses' name is taken out of his book, I mean, God didn't have to listen, of course. Moses is a mere mortal. But if Moses' name was taken out of the book, as Moses demanded, and the book, the Torah, was written for humans, for Jews, and Moses says the Jew, right, is taken out of his book, the Torah would lose a lot of its fizz. And so God said, okay, I'll acquiesce. I'll acquiesce, Moshe. I will forgive those that did not worship. I will not forgive those that did worship. And Moses was content. Because Moses made that threat, however, erase my name from your book, God took his name out of one book, and that was this week's Parsha. Why this week's Parsha? Because this week's Tetzaveh, where Moses' name is not mentioned, always falls out on the day of Moses' yard site, the day he passed. So it always falls out. And therefore, to recognize that it's the yard site and Hashem's decision to take him out of his book, it was done now, this Parsha. You know, I get it a lot. I get a lot of people who call me or email me or write and say, take me off your mailing list, right? So I kind of get the same treatment God got there. And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. It depends on who asks. So now Moses' name is not mentioned, and it's only V'ata, and you. Along comes the Lubavitcher Rebbe and says, yes, we can view it that Moses' name is taken out. Of course, you can view it that way, and you should view it that way. He says, however, there's more than meets the eye. The fact that the Torah doesn't use Moses' name is an incredible positive as opposed to the perceived negative. You see, what is in a name? What is a name? So a name is only for another person. If you live alone, when you come home to your house and you're home, there's no one home, you don't need a name. Tom Hanks in Castaway, he didn't need a name. Wilson, I guess, was his friend, but he didn't need a name. He lived alone. So why do you need to know? Why do you need a name? It's not for you, internal you. You don't need a name, but rather it's to identify you. So Moshe, Yaakov, Josh, you need a name for someone to call you, someone to get your attention, to call you to the Torah, etc. But you yourself, you don't need a name. So God, by saying you, Moshe, command the Jewish people, not you, Moshe, the external Moshe, but rather you, the inner you. I'm giving this to you, your internal you. And it fits right in with the message because you command the Jewish people. That's how the Torah begins. What should you do? You shall take unto yourself shemen zayis zach, virgin olive oil, crushed, in order to light the eternal light, which of course is referring to the menorah. So let's analyze it. It doesn't say to light the menorah, even though it means the menorah. It means to light an eternal light. So the Hasidic philosophy says as follows, that it's a fundamental teaching that Moshe was, the you of Moshe, the internal part of Moshe, had to teach the Jewish people. He says that you want to be able to keep the fire burning. You want to be able to assure the continuity of the Jewish existence. It's going to take crushing. It's going to take the olive oil being crushed. So what do we learn from an olive? You'll never get oil from the olive unless you press it. You'll never be able to get the virgin oil unless you squeeze it. So virgin oil needs a little stretch, needs a little squeeze. To get more oil, after the first pressing, then you really need to crush it. Moses was teaching us a fundamental lesson, and we see this time and time again. And that is, whenever the Jews have reached a point of serious comfort and riches and esteem and political influence, it's then that the spaghetti hits the fan. We can talk about the Purim story we just read, right? The Purim story, right before the Purim story, the king made an awesome feast. This feast went on for half a year, 180 days. The Jews were invited, and they went, and they partook of this feast. And they had tremendous influence. And then Haman said, wow, we seem to be inundated with Jews in office. I have to do something about it. Now, it's fine, but it's when the Jew starts forgetting who they are. So if we take a look at the inner story of Purim, and you take a look at the Midrash and the commentaries, is going to the party in itself was not a bad thing. You get invited by the king, you go and you bless the king and you say, may your reign and your fair reign continue unto eternity. But the Jews erred. Their erring was not by going to the feast. And the Midrash says there was kosher food given for the Jewish people. So it's not as if they ate loin chops, pork chops. It's the vessels they ate it from. The golden spoons they used, the golden forks that they used, right? They came from the temple that was destroyed. Purim's story was between the first and second temple. So King Ahasuerus was celebrating yet another year of him ruling most of the world, including Jerusalem, which was a difficult capture, as we know. So he was celebrating, and therefore he took out the same vessels that the high priest and the regular priests used in the temple, and he served it. And the Jews used these vessels, which are sacrosanct, to celebrate with him. In essence, he was celebrating the fall of Jerusalem, and the Jews were going, way to go, man. That was the issue. God said, you know what? They're too comfortable. So along comes Haman. And he catches the Jewish people. He squeezes them and presses them. And if you take a look at the story, their first response of the Jewish people, once there was this decree to wipe them out, the first response was, go gather the Jewish people, bring them into the synagogue, pray, fast, do teshuvah, repent, become better people. Hopefully we can avert the severity of the decree. It wasn't at first, arm yourselves. Let's go to Congress, Parliament. That did happen. But the very first thing that happened was, whoops, we made a mistake. And we need to correct that mistake. So instead of eating from the vessels, they fasted. Instead of celebrating like heathens, they mourned. Instead of worshiping Ahasuerus and his minions, they came back to basics and worshiped God. And we can fast forward throughout history. We can fast forward to when Jews lived in Moscow, and they were begging the Tsarist government to close the yeshivas, to close the shuls. He goes, peasantry, if you want to continue Jewish peasantry, you'll keep the yeshivas open. If you want to continue this pathetic form of worship, instead of celebrating the Tsar and the accomplishments of Mother Russia, if you want to end that, you'll close these yeshivas. And so the Jews in Moscow got too comfortable, and they got too cocky, and they got too comfortable with themselves. And along comes anti-Semitism. Jews were forbidden to live in Moscow. Talk about, they lived there, right? No, Hail of the settlement. You're only allowed to live where we tell you to live. Jews were accused of dual loyalty, right? Sending money to Israel, which was ruled by the arch enemy, the Ottoman Empire. Jews were killed in pogroms because of this. It didn't work. And we fast forward to Germany, right? It was the Vysotsky movement, the Enlightenment movement had made a shift. So in Russia, they were called the Vysotsky, and they had they wanted the yeshivas closed. In Germany, they were called by other names, the Bund and the Jewish Bund, and they wanted to stop Jews being Jewish. They said no, thank you. They said it doesn't. We don't gain anything by it. He says if you want to be Jewish, you can practice Judaism in your house. You want to wear a kippah in the house, right? You want to do it in the house. So Yehudi Babayit, a Jew in the house, and a citizen of Germany outwardly. And it didn't work because we know Hitler did not discriminate between the religious, the irreligious. Hitler didn't care. So when you try to appease, and when you try to hide whom you are, along comes the crushing. Along comes an olive. In order to get the oil, to get its best from the olive, you need to squeeze it. In order to get the best Jew to come out, you need to squeeze it. Sometimes you need to press it, and sometimes you need to crush it. But that's the only way to have a ner tamid. That's the only way to have an eternal flame. It's the only way. And God told Moses, not as Moses, but Va'ata, you Jewish people, who Moses was the representative, you got to learn this lesson. And by the way, God forbid anything should happen. God forbid anything should happen to Jews in America, but we're getting lax again. And we're beginning to confuse and conflate Torah values with progressivism. Now, I'm not against progressivism. I'm against progressivism when it conflicts with Torah. Right? You want to have a minimum wage rate? Beautiful. I'm all for it. Make my life harder? Yeah, that's fine. We'll adapt. But you want to tell me that a man is a woman is a man, and you can no longer say Mr. Potato Head, and you can no longer, which I don't care about, but you want to tell me some of this nonsense that you're shoving down my throat, which is antithetical to Torah. I say you're walking down a dark path. You can also say different people. You can no longer identify as being as one type of sex. That's insane. Listen, you want to do that for yourself, that's fine, but you cannot make it a law. And worse than that, you have Jews who are pushing the envelope to make this a law, right? Who else voted for this nutty form of progressivism? And I think we need to catch it before it's too late. I could care less, by the way, if somebody cross-dresses. I could care less if somebody says they're gay. I could care less, and good luck to them. But don't make it a law that forces me to forgo Torah. That's all I care. Because then we get crushed. The Torah then continues Wow, that was a long monologue, wasn't it? Ooh, right, that was a lot. That was a gas attack. The Torah then continues and he talks about the Cohen Kadal, that the high priest had to have certain garments. The high priest, as a representative of God, had to look regal, right? He was the embodiment of attaining atonement for the Jewish people. Right? That's probably where the Christians got their idea from, by the way, that there's somebody can get atonement for you. But the Kohen Gadol had to be holy. He could not think any alien thoughts while he was wearing these vestments, punishable by death, divine death. And his whole vestments that he wore was designed not only to make everybody else in awe of him, but to make himself in awe of God. He wore the hat, and etc., etc. There's one interesting thing that he wore was the choshen. It was a breastplate that had that was made of solid gold, that was tied, and it went on his heart, and it was tied down. So when he moved, it didn't flap, but rather remained attached to his heart. On it were 12 precious jewels. I know Jewish women say there's only one precious jewel, but Torah begs to differ. One of them, yes, was a diamond, and 12 precious jewels, and the jewels on this jewel was engraved the name of the tribes. So the first, and there was three, right? There were three lines, 4 precious jewels on each line. And there was the ruby, and there was the emerald, and there was the sapphire, and there was the yashbeson, whatever that is, etc., etc. And each stone had the name of a tribe, which, in other words, the job of the Kohen was attain atonement for the Jewish people equally. There was nobody written in bigger letters. There was nobody written in smaller letters. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he managed to attain atonement equally. If there was a collective sin, if there was an individual sin, if there was a communal sin, a global sin, that was his job. So he wore this, and he wore it 354 days of the year. On the 355th day of the year, which is a Jewish year has 355 days. That is why the Hebrew word for year is Shana. You heard Rosh Hashanah, right? Shana, the numerical value of Shana, Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, is Shana, Shen equals 300, Nun equals 5, Hey equals 50. There's 350 days, 55 days in a Jewish year, in a lunar year. And one day a year, he took them off. One day a year, he took off this clothing, and that was Yom Kippur. And he only wore white, no gold, no purple, no scarlet, no stones, no nothing, just simplicity. He went in with a linen hat, a linen shirt, linen pants, and a linen belt, all white linen. Which, by the way, and he went into the holies of holies. By the way, just as a parenthetically, a Jew is buried in exactly those garments. And when the Cohen went into the holies of holies to meet God, he was dressed in those garments. When a Jew passes and his body's put in the grave and the soul ascends, that's exactly what he wears. Why? Because the soul is going to meet God, and it's an intense meeting. So we learn from the holies of holies that it's not a time for opulence. It's not, and that's why Jews bury in a plain casket, is because it's not a time for opulence. How much money do you have? So do you have an imported poplar wood from Zimbabwe, or do you have a simple pine from Dix Hills? From the Pine Barrens, right? Right. So it's not a time for opulence. It's a time for sincerity. And we know that when a person passes, Jew or Gentile, you don't take your riches with you. You don't take your BMW, and you don't take your house in Boca, and you don't take your stock certificates. The only thing you take is you. It's you, which is what you've accomplished, etc. That's parenthetically. Going back to the text. So he on the holiest day of the year, it was just him. It was just him, no opulence, and he represented the basic Jewish fundamental, and that is Afa Pi Shechata. And this is a line. This is a line from the Talmud, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe lived by this line. Okay, this was his mantra. This was his raison d'être. Even though he sinned, Yisrael who? He's still a Jew. Right? The Rebbe, and by extension, the Rebbe's followers live by that as well. That you can't be judgmental on a person because of what they've done, because nobody's perfect, and everybody has a level of hypocrisy. Everybody, I don't care who it is, maybe not a Rebbe, but everybody has a level of hypocrisy, right? So some have a gross level, some have a refined level, some have a subtle level, very subtle level, but we all have it. So therefore, to judge somebody when you do the same thing, albeit on a subtle level, is hypocrisy. So that's the message. Afa pi shechata Yisrael. And that's what Aaron did. Aaron went into that holies of holies. He went in and he said, dear God, it's Yom Kippur, the day where you promised you would forgive. Right? Yisrael, it's still your people. Right? Right? Still your people. In fact, according to Jewish law, right? According to Jewish law, if somebody, right, turns their back on Judaism, they're still Jewish. They're still Jewish. Right? You cannot, Jewish law is, if a person converts, right, they're still Jewish. So they do terrible things because they converted, but they're still Jewish. And that was, by the way, just when in the Knesset in the 1950s, the Knesset passed a rule called the law of return, that because if Israel had existed before Nazi Germany, Jews would have been saved. There wouldn't have been 6 million dead. You know, after the first 100, everybody gets out and you go to Israel, but you couldn't. There was a blockade. The British, in their infinite wisdom, along with the Germans and the Turks and the Poles, killed 6 million. And America has some Star of Davids to bear as well, right? Roosevelt was not a nice man when it came to Jews, as opposed to his, by the way, the fellow that took him over, right? Eisenhower, Truman. I'm sorry, Truman was an incredible president to the Jewish people, and there was a lot of Eisenhower had great relationships with the Jewish people. It was, unfortunately, we had Roosevelt there, who did great things, but he was immoral. So the law of return, they passed it. The law of return. A Jew that wants to move to Israel, right, get on a plane and come, and that is your citizenship. You're a citizen, right? Now, if you move in peaceful times, so you sign up, you fill out a paperwork, etc. And the only thing they'll do is check if you're Jewish and you have no diseases, etc. And they'll let you in. So what happened? A fellow by the name of Daniel, I forget his last name, fellow by the name of Daniel came to Israel and he says, I'm Jewish and I wish to become a citizen. However, Daniel was dressed in monk's clothing. Daniel had become a monk. Daniel worshipped false idols. So there became an uproar. Is brother Daniel a Jew or not? can we accept Daniel or not? Is that what the law of return means? It went to Supreme Court. And fascinating, because I never would have believed they came up. They said, Brother Daniel is not eligible for citizenship. Right? That was their, now I think they were sending a lesson, but it's still a fascinating ruling because Afa Pishachota Yisrael. I think if the Rebbe was sitting on the Supreme Court, maybe the Rebbe would have taken a different stand. Who knows? Who knows? What ifs? So what ifs? So the Torah continues, and the Torah tells us about the choshen, the breastplate, and all these things that he wore, and he also wore 2 onyx stones on his shoulders, and he wore, which also had 6 tribes were engraved on one side, 6 tribes were engraved on the other side. So you can tell that was important to God. And one interesting thing that he wore was something called the tzitz. This tzitz, which is hard to pronounce, was a golden, solid gold, and it was flexible, and it was placed on his head and bent to the shape of his forehead. It was attached through this psychedelic blue string to his forehead, and it had the words Kodesh LaHashem, holiness to the Lord. God is holy. And he walked around, and they said that the tzitz atoned for other sins. So so it was a combo. You had the ephod, you had the choshen, the breastplate, and you had the tzitz, the forehead plate, and they atoned for other sins. What's interesting is, and this is incredibly difficult, when the Cohen wore the tzitz, and only the high priest wore it, he was not allowed to raise his hands above the plate. So if he wanted to scratch his head, he had to get someone to do it for him, right? Because he was not allowed to raise, and that's why on the menorah that the Cohen, the high priest, lit in the Holy Temple, remember 354 days he wore the garb, including the tzitz. There were steps. It was like a ladder, because otherwise he would be going like this above his head, and he couldn't. So he had to go like this. There was the ladder, and they say Aaron wasn't so tall, so it had to be a decent sized ladder. He couldn't lift his hands above. And but when it came to the holies of holies, he didn't wear gold. The last thing he wanted to do is remind God of the golden calf. So he did not wear gold. Now, the choshen, this breastplate, was attached to a piece of material. This piece of material was made out of, woven with 6 different types. There was gold in it, there was silver in it, there was purple wool and scarlet wool and linen. And it was, the gold, by the way, was solid gold. It was 24 karat gold that was basically weaved into strings, right? Thinner, much thinner than a bracelet, a necklace, the thin necklace. And it was able to be woven. And he wore that, and it had a pocket. It had a fold. Inside that fold was something called the Urim and Tumim. The Urim and Tumim was not considered part of the 8 garments. The Urim and Tumim, Moses did. Moses, it was simply, God told him that I want you to write the following. He wrote the following, which was the elongated name of God, which we do not have today. So we know we have, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey. We know we have, which, and then today we write Yud Yud, but that's not really the name of God. So, and that, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey is one of the names of God. It's a tetragrammaton. It's the holiest name we can address, right? And even then we don't say it. We say Adonai in its place, right? So Moses wrote that 72, and it's somewhere in the Torah, by the way. They say that it's somewhere there is the 72 letters name of God written, but it's over different verses, etc. And Moses put that in the pouch, in the fold. The fold was as such, I don't know if you can see, and it was put in between, and then the breastplate went on top. That Urim V'Tumim only lasted from Moses until the first temple was destroyed. Once the first temple was destroyed, the Urim V'Tumim, that piece of parchment, disappeared. It was no longer available. The Jews had to be at a certain level in order to merit to have that. And when the high priest had the Urim V'Tumim, the high priest had prophecy. And he was guided by the Choshen. So they asked a question, and he meditated that he had an Urim V'Tumim, he had this parchment, and he touched the breastplate, and he came up with an answer. Because the breastplate had vibes to it, and the letters were engraved. Some letters protruded more than others, and he was able to decipher and give an answer. So it was just an incredible thing, but unfortunately, we lost it. We lost it when the temple was destroyed. The Torah tells us that the sons of Aaron, in other words, the regular Kohanim, they never wore gold, ever. They only wore 4 clothing. They wore the hat. They wore the same thing that the Cohen Kadal wore in the Holy Temple on Yom Kippur. The difference is the hat. The Cohen Gadol's white hat was much greater, more it was puffed up, it was taller than a regular Kohen's hat. But the shirt and the pants, and by the way, there was no shoes, there was no socks, there was no underwear, there was no Under Armour, there was nothing like that, no sneakers, there was no Reeboks. This Torah class has been sponsored by Reebok. There was nothing like that. There was no shoes, and if you think in the holy desert, it's one thing. They walked on the sand in the desert, but when they went to the holy temple, the stones were freezing because Jerusalem is not exactly the hottest place on earth, and in the winter it gets cold, and in fact there were fires burning all in the holy temple to keep the priests warm. But the floor was the floor. It didn't have radiant heat back then, and it kept the Kohanim moving. They didn't even want to stay in one place, and so the Kohanim had no choice but to move with zeal and alacrity because the floor was cold. So there was no shoes in the Holy Temple, and this is probably why you walk into a mosque, you have to remove your shoes. Everything comes ultimately from the Jewish way of worship. Now, we don't have to remove our shoes in a synagogue, but we would have to remove our shoes in an extra holy place, in the Holy Temple, or when you visit a grave, right? When you visit a holy grave, there's a custom to not wear leather. So I know when I go to the Ohel, when I go to the grave where the Rebbe's buried, the previous Rebbe's buried, when I go to the grave, when I went to graves in Ukraine, there was one consistency. I went to mikveh before that morning. Every morning I went to mikveh before I visited a grave, and I removed my leather shoes and put on sneakers. Sneakers are not necessarily conducive for icy slopes because the graves are sometimes in remote areas in the base of a valley, and it was treacherous. And I went with a group, and everybody's wearing these non-leather shoes, and we had every so often you hear a collapse, and somebody fell, and one guy, he actually dislocated his shoulder, and there was a doctor that put it back, and you heard the scream a mile away. It was terrible. And yeah, I didn't fall, but I was holding on to branches for dear life. But maybe if I wore, maybe I should have got chains under my feet. But so the Kohanim, yeah, they wore four clothing. Interesting to note that the inauguration was done, a few different things had to be done with the inauguration. They had to bring sacrifices, special sacrifices that took place that day and no other day. the Kohanim were anointed with oil, right? So the Kohanim actually, Moshe dipped his hands in oil and he sprinkled it on the Kohen, and then he sprinkled it on the altar, right? I don't know, I'm not a connoisseur of sprinklings, but I know that Christian faith has this sprinklings of water, right? And once again, you can trace its source. It's just fascinating how the Judaism had such an impact on the world. So Moshe, and also, by the way, these brand new clothes of gold and beautiful looking things were stained with olive oil, because they had to be anointed. Even the clothes had to be anointed. Now, if my mother was there, she would have fixed that. But so olive oil was poured on his head. Olive oil was placed on his face, between his eyes, on the clothing, on the altar, on the vessels, right? And they anointed him, right? Here's the interesting thing. When the high priest died and his son, the high priest, took over, there was no inauguration. There was no anointing, nothing. It was basically the son stepped into the shoes of the father, and it was part of the legacy, part of the dynasty. And they didn't need to create a new thing, which is a lesson in life. You know, we have parents, right? We're humans, and therefore we have parents. Our parents did many good things, many great things. It's our job just to step right into those shoes and move on, right? Our job is not necessarily to sever what they did. Yeah, the bad things, of course, but to sever what they did, but rather just jump right into their shoes and continue walking. And that's what the son of the Cohen did, right? Is that there was no inauguration. The only time they had an inauguration, which is very different than this inauguration, because they weren't inaugurating also the altar, and they were inaugurating the person. Then if it was a non-son, yeah, they had to be anointed with oil. If he wasn't anointed with oil, he was not fit to serve in the Holy Temple. And if he went into the holies of holies without being anointed with oil, he was a dead man walking. So he had to be anointed. When Mashiach comes, Mashiach will have to be anointed, right? He would have to get the olive oil. And by the way, I just bought some unbelievable olive oil, which I have with sourdough bread. It's unbelievable. I want to use that one. Maybe no, you know what? Don't waste that one. And then the Torah goes on. They had to put blood from the sacrifices on the ear, right? On that, the person should be, the Cohen should be sensitive to the blood of the Jewish people, right? They had to put it on his hands. Cohen had to take action, because otherwise he'll have blood in his hand. They put it on his feet. The Cohen had to run to make sure that nothing untoward happened to the Jewish people. So, and there's other reasons as well. This went on for 7 days. After 7 days, and then Moshe, by the way, instructed them how to do it. 7 days, so the Kohanim started to prepare now daily service. After the first day, they had the major inauguration. The next 6 days were, this is what you got to do. This is what you got to do. You got to offer this sacrifice in the morning, this sacrifice in the afternoon. You got to sprinkle this, and you got to offer this and this fine flour, and you have to fry, griddle, whatever they did. They had different types of recipes. They had like 10 different types of matzah, right? And probably way tastier than anything we got. And it was fried in oil. So I'm thinking it's matzah bread. That's what I'm thinking. But or matzah balls or something like that. But they really did. They really, some matzah was in water, some matzah was in oil, some was fried, some was baked, some was, and sorry. Yeah. They had different thing. Took place for 7 days. After 7 days, Moses was stripped of his title as the Cohen Kadal, and it was given to Aaron. So it's interesting, those 7 days, until the 7 days, Moses was the Cohen, the leader, the everything, chief cook and bottle washer. During those 7 days, he reigned together with Aaron, because he was the Cohen Kadal. Aaron was the Cohen Kadal in training. Once those 7 days were over, Moshe stepped down. Aaron took over. And this is also a fundamental lesson. You cannot have two chiefs. You cannot. You can't have two presidents at the same time. You can't have one president doing one strategy, and then people undermining him doing another. So you can't have that. We have to be united under one president. You have to be united under one Cohen Kadol, right? You cannot have, because that creates fraction and friction. It creates factors and fraction and friction, and then you have the split of the Jewish people. So Moses, I don't know if the word is abdicated his title, but relinquished his title. He wasn't happy about it. He loved nothing else to be the high priest, right? But he realized that he cannot do it. It took a level of pureness and humility to be able to say, okay, I'm the ruler, no more. Aaron, the service of the Holy Temple, I'll be the Nasi, I'm the prince, and you're the Kohen Gadol, you're the high priest. Now, what's interesting is just like in the United States, we have 3 branches of government. On the Holy Temple, on the Temple Mount, in the Mishkan, there were 3 branches of government. Before they went to war, Moshe couldn't say, war, right? Moshe had to consult the Sanhedrin, the judicial body. Moshe had to consult Aaron the priest, right? And then it was Moshe. So Moshe was prince and Aaron was Cohen. And then they consulted the judicial, and it was checks and balances that way. 3 branches of God. And then when Moshe passed, Joshua took over. One of the big issues of Hanukkah, by the way, of Judah the Maccabee, and Judah Maccabee was a hero and a warrior, etc. However, after the war, he became both. He became the Nasi, the prince, and he became the Kohen Gadol. And that was considered a power grab. Yeah, and so Judah was his son. Right? Judah was his son. Yochanan, Matisyahu, Judah. Judah was the Kohen Gadol. He could not be the prince. It was considered a power grab. And when you have a power grab, you end up with trouble. The last thing the Torah talks about is the golden altar. So in previous parsha, we read everything that they built. This week's parsha, they added, and next week they'll add something else. They added the golden altar. The golden altar was as opposed to golden altar was only incense, was only spices, and its fire wasn't as large as the outer altar, which was huge and was filled with earth. The golden altar was not filled with earth, rather it was hollow, but it had a roof of gold. The copper altar did not have a roof. The roof was earth. In other words, you offered these sacrifices over wood, and the wood sat on the earth. The pilings sat on the earth. The golden altar was only for spices, and it came into play every day, but especially came into play in Yom Kippur. That, they say, was the final act of the Cohen offering the incense that he took out of the holies of holies and placed on the golden altar. They question why was not the golden altar mentioned with everything else? And there's a few different answers. One answer is that if they were lacking the menorah, you couldn't, it was incomplete. You could not move ahead. If you were lacking the table, you were incomplete, and you did not have, the Mishkan had a void, and you had to bring, before you continue with your service, you had to, if you didn't have a golden altar, it did not affect other things. Did not affect. So the golden altar was that's why it wasn't included with the must-haves, because even though it's a must-have, if for some reason it's not there, you could still live with it in the temple, but you could not live without the copper altar, etc. There are others that mention if the golden altar was missing, you just have to have it ready by Yom Kippur. That's where it really comes into play. Thus concludes the Torah portion of the week. Hope you food for thought, and may God bless you. If you have questions, by highcenter.com, and have a blessed week.